Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Morgan Vogel. I'm the Assistant Director at the UNO Center for Public Affairs Research, and we are so excited to welcome you to part 2 of the 2024 Data and Research Series for Community Impact. Our mission at the Center for Public Affairs Research is to produce and disseminate high-quality public scholarship about topics that impact the lives of Nebraskans. We are guided by this work in our 4 core values, which you see on the screen, of collaboration, purpose, aspiration, and research integrity. This long-running professional development series, which hopefully you've participated in the past, has allowed us to apply all 4 values for 35 years. We really value the opportunity to bring folks together to learn about how to find and apply data, and we believe that with data, we can make a positive impact in the state and in our communities by learning and growing together. At CPAR, we have always been and will continue to be your go-to source for census data in the state of Nebraska. We are always willing to help you find and analyze census data. As discussed or as mentioned during part 1 of our series in September, we've recently created a new census data request form. This is on our website. You can find it at cpar.unomaha.edu, and you see what it looks like on the screen to help serve your census data requests. You can use this form to tell us a little bit about your data request and then select the topics that are of interest to you. Nearly all of our research projects at CPAR, Community Engaged, and otherwise begin with some aspect of census data, and that's where we're going to start our day today. So CPAR Director Dr. Josie Schafer will share the new data from the latest release of the American Community Survey, 5-year estimates, just released a few weeks ago from the U.S. Census Bureau, and then she will also provide a presentation of the most recent trends in Nebraska. We'll take a quick 15-minute break at 10:30, and then we'll be joined by Adam Grundy, a supervisory statistician at the U.S. Census Bureau, to provide us with a brief overview of some of the Census Bureau resources available to describe the economy and how to access some of those data resources. Then we will conclude the day with a presentation about some of the recent trends and an outlook of the national and metropolitan economy from Dr. Dustin White, who's an associate professor at UNO in the Department of Economics. A few housekeeping items before we get started today. Please submit your questions via the Q&A function. We will monitor those and we'll ask those questions for you throughout the presentations. In your registration confirmation email, you received a link to a webpage where you can find presentation materials and a link to the evaluation. And Tara Grell has already put those in the chat so you can see those. We appreciate any feedback that you are willing to provide us about your experience today, and it really helps us plan next year's event. So please share your feedback with us. And then the recording from today will also be made available on that same webpage. You'll receive a link to that when the recording is available. Okay, and now I get to introduce Dr. Josie Schafer, Director of the UNO Center for Public Affairs Research, to kick us off with our presentation today. Josie joined UNO's College of Public Affairs and Community Service in 2018 as Director of CPAR. Her personal project portfolio ranges from several smaller community-engaged research projects where she works collaboratively with community partners to more of her high-profile work, like working with the Planning Committee of Nebraska State Legislature. Recent projects led by Josie include the research and analysis for the 6 Regions One Nebraska initiative with the Department of Economic Development, constant review of demographic, housing, workforce trends in Omaha neighborhoods, collaboration with UNMC to analyze the status and the future of the healthcare workforce in Nebraska, and then her ongoing work with the Kauffman Foundation to support inclusive entrepreneurship in the state. I can speak to this, that as Director of CPAR, Josie is constantly asking, how does CPAR impact the region? And she always invites community engagement and ensures that our work is rooted in impact. So we have no better person to talk to us today than Josie. Take it away.
Thank you, Morgan. There's no better person to have on with me this morning. So I appreciate that wonderful introduction, and I am so excited. You said this data was released weeks ago. I feel like it was a day ago. And that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. The 2023 5-year release of the American Community Survey was December 12th of 2024. I was supposed to get embargo access a few days before, but I have never been able to access the embargo data on the website. So I started analyzing this data on December 12th so that we could share the newest data with you all. The American Community Survey, which I'm going to talk a little bit about the product before we jump into the data, is a large survey asking questions about the sociodemographics, housing, and economics of Nebraska. If you are using census data, you are most likely using American Community Survey. The Census Bureau has over 100 data products. We've talked about many different ones before, but the American Community Survey one is the one most people know and use for a wide variety of things. This is just a link to the questionnaire, how to access. We do have a dashboard of census data by county, as well as census data by legislative districts. They have not been updated to the 2023 5-year yet, but they will be starting in the new year, working to do that. We hadn't updated the legislative districts in a while because of redistricting. The data hadn't been released that way, but now you'll get 2 years with the redistricted districts, as well as those county dashboards. So check out our CPAR unomaha.edu SDC State Data Center page for that. Also, of course, through data.census.gov, which we'll look at a little bit today. We also just completed the 6 Regions 1 Nebraska project and initiative from the Governor's Office, Department of Economic Development, and the Nebraska State Chamber, and that includes a lot of American Community Survey data by county as well. Things we don't release on the dashboard. So that's still 2022 5-year, but lots of data in there. American Community Survey is 3.5 million respondents annually. That is a huge survey. That is a survey we can have a lot of confidence in. And we're going to talk about what confidence in surveys is a little bit more. I just want to put that in contrast to a poll. A poll and a survey are not the same things. They are both really valuable resources when we're trying to understand what people need and want and are looking for, but they are different. Surveys are typically much larger, which gives us more confidence, allows us to put some margin of error on this data to say, yeah, we think we're close to the actual number in the population, sample to population. A poll is not going to release population numbers the way the American Community Survey can. So for instance, a Pew Research Center poll is about 1,500 respondents, right? Big difference. It's also a long survey, can take up to 40 minutes to complete. That's why we have that rich data. It's also why we don't ask all those questions, for instance, in the decennial census, because we need participation, and we find when we ask a lot of questions, we lose participation in surveys. Good tip for all of you. There are 1-year estimates and 5-year estimates released. We talked about the 1-year estimates at the part 1 of the data and research series just a little bit. We looked at the comparative profiles to see what data is changing in the 1-year estimates. That was released September 12th. Only for population 65,000 or more. So we get some state data and we're able to look at some of our largest counties, and that's about it, our metro areas. But we really don't get that data throughout the state. We are a small state. So we tend to also, as you start to break down data into smaller groups, like we're going to look at net migration rates today by county, those are small numbers. You want more data. Good tip. When it comes to data, you always want more, not less. So those 5-year estimates are the data we really spend time with. It's released for all counties, places, that's like cities, zip code tabulation areas, and census tracts, which range from about 1,200 to 8,000 people. In Nebraska, in some of the rural areas, that's a county. But you get some breakdown sub-county level in some of our larger counties. So that can be really useful. Quick comparison of the 1-year estimates versus 5-year estimates, just so you understand a little bit more about this. It is important when you're looking at data that you don't have to understand exactly how they got there, but you definitely want to know which one you want to use and why. So the 1-year estimates are timely. There are 3.5 million respondents annually, so it is still a very large data product, but it won't be available for small geographies. You also won't get a lot of the sort of sub-tables that you might be looking for where you sort of deep dive into a topic. Here I'm showing you the 1-year estimates versus the 5-year estimates on educational attainment. So they estimate the population. So they take a sample of data, the people who responded to the survey, and they estimate or scale up to the population number. Based on our sample number, what is that population number? And you do see a fairly large difference, about a 17,000 people difference outside of the margin of error on both for the 1-year versus 5-year estimates. So 1.3 million versus 1.29 million. Substantively, it's the morning, I'll be able to say that by the afternoon. I don't think there's a large difference between these two numbers. I don't know how policy or programming would change based on the difference in these numbers, but they are a large difference. 5-year estimate is pooling data across 5 years. It is not a simple average of the 5-year data. It is not data for the midpoint of those 5 years of data. It is a much more complicated statistical process of weighting data to try to come up with a 2023 number using data going back 60 months, I believe is 5 years. So it is more data being used to estimate what's going on right now. One of the things we know about people is things don't change that much year to year. I think people like to think they do. And there are some numbers that are certainly on the move in Nebraska as well as nationally. But those 5-year estimates are going to give us more data to be able to estimate these things going out into the rural geographies. Because we are a small state and because we break down so many of these numbers, we tend to consistently use the 5-year estimates whenever possible. We really trust those. And by trust, I mean, look at the difference in the margin of error on those numbers. Now, these are so far apart that the margin of error we don't end up, and you're not supposed to compare 1-year to 5-year estimates. So it's not like I can say, okay, so the number's somewhere in the middle. We just know it's about there. But that's the margin of error. 5-year estimates is always going to have a smaller margin of error. But I really want you to focus on percentages. And the Census Bureau itself recommends very clearly that when you are looking at American Community Survey data, that you look at percentages, means, medians, rates, trends. Is it positive or is it negative? We're going to be looking at a lot of actual counts, but I don't want you to focus so much on the count. It is a survey and they are scaling to a population to get that count. So there is a high degree of uncertainty. That's why the margin of error is bigger on the number as compared to the percentage. The percentage, we're just looking at those sample numbers, so we get a smaller margin of error. And that's good advice in all survey research, that you really focus on the percentages, the trends, not necessarily to the number. Scaling up to that population number is going to have a lot of uncertainty in it. So even when we're looking at numbers today, really just be thinking about trends and don't focus so much on the number. I can think of sometimes this summer when I was out presenting 6 regions, 1 Nebraska data, and we were looking in small counties at net migration by age group. So small, and smaller. And then folks were really like, no, I know somebody that moved in, so that number can't be right. And you're right contextually, and I bet you could actually get to the number better than the survey can sometimes in those smaller places, but we're really just trying to look at how things are moving over time. So that's why we focus more on percentages and some of those than the estimate or the number count. And that this just gives you a really good sense of how these differ in lots of ways. Okay, so before I jump into the American Community Survey, I want to level set some of what we talked about in part 1, and sort of what numbers we're going to dig into using the ACS as compared to some of what we talked about in part 1. So this is a slide you've seen for us for a while. This is the decennial census and the population change 2010 to 2020. The decennial census is still the official count. That 2020 number will be with us for a while. It becomes the starting place of the population estimates data that we're going to look at next. So this is a trend we saw over the past decade. Yes, we absolutely grew. We grew 7.4% as a state whole, but we really had just sort of some pockets of growth in our metro areas largely, as well as Platte County. And we had some stabilization, right? Some counties that had very small growth or very small decline. So sort of a sitting trend in some of those rural areas. Then we can't just live off 2020 decennial census data for an entire decade. So the United States Census Bureau also releases population estimates. And this data had just come out when we did part one, which we did in a hybrid model. So we had lots of folks with us in person. We had some folks online that those presentation slides can be purchased along with a recording from the day. If you're interested in the population estimates data, you'll see just a little bit of it here, but we went deep dive in part one. So population estimates data is not a survey like the American Community Survey. I like to think of these folks at the Census Bureau. They stay in their office and they are using administrative data and statistical techniques to estimate the population year to year. It comes out sooner than the ACS data. So that 2023 data was released back in September. And it gives you overall population, components of population change, I'll show it on the next slide, as well as some details about age and race and ethnicity. Same number we use in population projections, same numbers we use in population projections. So these are kind of the official estimates in between the decennial census. So when we use just like a total population count at the state or county level, if that's all you need, I usually push you to population estimates as compared to the American Community Survey. Because again, more data is always better, and they are able to really focus on getting those official counts precise, while the survey data is less focused on that and more on the descriptive detail. So if you just need a total population count, I might push you to population estimates. We showed you where that data was accessible in part one. It is different than from in data.census.gov. So since 2020, since the decennial census into 2023, we're seeing actually a very similar pattern, a 0.8% gain. About that gain in population over 3 years would get us a little under where we were in the last decade. So we're not, we are still projected to grow. It's not a huge amount of growth over the next decade projected. We don't know, things can change. But you also see some counties that were not growing in the last decade growing. These are now really Dual County, Frontier County, Sioux County. Now these are small counties to begin with. So there you have the percent change over just those 3 years. So some small numbers. You also see the actual population increase, right? So Sioux County, 23, Blaine County with their big 1.8% growth is 8 people. So not huge numbers in terms of growth, but a real trend difference than we saw in the last decade. So something we really wanted to be able to dig into with this ACS data and will today. But the population estimates data really only tells us some big chunky numbers. These are those net international migration, net domestic migration, and natural change, that red line. Most of Nebraska's growth as a state whole and county to county is driven by natural change. That's births minus deaths. And you see that number has been consistently positive for us going back to 2010, little dip in 2020, but we're back pretty strong. I showed this data in part one, where we actually are 6th in the country on natural change. So really positive there. Then you see our net international migration line just sort of bumping along. I gave some context about that. Our net domestic migration line, though, has been consistently negative since 2010, although you see us coming back up, a trend in a really positive direction. It is still estimated to be negative, but it is not as negative as it has been, right, just a year ago. So something to really dig in on, but we can't dig in from that source. We have to start using ACS data to really look at movement, especially county to county, as those are small numbers. So let's get into our ACS data. I've tried to be really clear when I'm using population estimates versus ACS data. Most of what you'll see going forward is that American Community Survey data that we are so excited to have ready for you. This is a slide I do tend to present a lot. We're looking at net migration within Nebraska and net migration with other states. Net migration within Nebraska in red, net migration with other states in the gray. I'm about to show you several of these slides broken down in a couple different ways, so get used to seeing them. And let me walk you through these county groups. So we have rural counties, 72 rural counties. That means there's no population density of 2,000 or more in population. So these are rural counties. There's, they have population, but it tends to be spread out. There's no urban centers or urban clusters. We have a lot of those counties at 72. And I want to look at that net migration within Nebraska. That's red, and that number is negative. Now, I do give you a specific count. Putting these in percentages to the population can sometimes be a little bit confusing. So I'm going to give you those official counts. There are large margins of error on these numbers. They're small numbers, broken down numbers. It's not precise to 1,891 people that net left. And as you know, people move in and people leave. So getting to that net number can be a little bit of a challenge, but I feel very confident it's negative, right? And it's negative to an extent. And we'll also put it in context to years prior to give us some trend lines. So you see that number is negative, as well as domestic migration, net migration with other states is negative. Move over to our micropolitan counties. There's 9 of those, places like Lincoln, Buffalo, Hastings, Platte, Gage County, places that have micropolitan cities. Those counties, sometimes the surrounding counties are included as well. You have net migration within Nebraska as negative, as well as net migration with other states as negative. Outlying metro, negative, but that's a pretty small number. I still feel confident it's negative, but it is negative to a small extent, and very similar with net migration with other states. Outlying metro, like Cass and Washington County. I'm going to show you all of them, actually, 7 of those counties. And so where did all these Nebraskans go? They showed up in core metro counties, metropolitan cities, the counties that are part of those metropolitan areas. I'll show you all 5 of those counties in a second. So you see when the folks left all of those other county types for somewhere else in Nebraska, they showed up in the core metro. That trend has been consistent over time, as well as this other trend. Once in the metro, we tend to net lose people to other states. I want to put this in context of 2020. Like I said, I tend to produce this every year, but just to give you a sense of how things are shaking out. Rural counties lost about the same number of people to other areas of Nebraska, while micropolitan counties lost a few more. Rural counties lost a few more. So is that still showing correctly? I think so. Sorry,
Yes,
I hit something. Thank you. You see a little bit, I'm comparing to this slide, and how many more people, to give you a sense of the trend over time. What's really exciting in 2023, those outlying metro, yes, they still lost population in 2023, but they're losing less. And then the core metro has gained about the same number, but they are losing more to other states. So comparing back to this slide to 2020, I want to break down some of these numbers because even these county groupings can kind of obscure some of the detail that's going on. Okay, so these are our 5 core metro counties. And honestly, this has been really interesting to look at. So yes, they are gaining population from elsewhere in the state, but it's mainly Lancaster County that's driving that. And if you break it down by age groups, as we did in the 6 regions, 1 Nebraska, you might not be surprised to find that that gain of folks from elsewhere in the state to Lancaster County tends to be among 18 to 19-year-olds, right? So it's folks moving from other parts of the state to go, I would assume, to UNL into Lancaster County. So that is that main gain. Then you see a positive, medium to small positive in Sarpy County and a little bit of a gain in Hall County. Douglas County is actually losing people to elsewhere in the state. My guess is Sarpy, right? That's that movement into the suburbs as well as the exurbs, which I'll show in a minute. So Douglas County is not really gaining. Now, do people from elsewhere in the state move into Douglas County? Absolutely, just more people move out of Douglas County for elsewhere in the state. Like I said, they're still probably in that core metro. A lot of those 18 to 19-year-olds showing up in Lancaster County, for instance, are from Douglas County, a large county to begin with. So you see that number being negative, and you also see a lot of the net migration with other states out of Douglas County. Historically, Douglas County gained a lot of people from elsewhere in the state. That's where how it grew. But now its growth is totally driven by natural change. And I showed a county natural change growth rates slide in the population estimate. So they're in the population estimates presentation in part 1, right? So when we think about some of these larger counties, when we think about smaller counties, they may be losing population to elsewhere in the state, but they can still grow somewhat if they have a younger population that is still going to have and be settled there and have children there and grow that way. So that is where a lot of the growth throughout the state is. And so you might look at this and be like, how can Douglas County lose population but still be growing? And that's that natural change rate. Lancaster tends to grow through both natural change and that net migration within Nebraska, people moving there, and then they lose a couple to out of state. So it's just interesting to point out when we say that core metro group is growing, that is definitely true from folks elsewhere in Nebraska, but it's not consistent across those 5 counties. There are differences. There are also differences in our outlying metro counties. So in 2023, we were negative for net migration within Nebraska and net migration with other states, but we were less negative than in 2020 and historically. This is the first time in a long time we're seeing some of those outlying metro counties gain population from elsewhere in Nebraska. And you see very specifically Cass County and Saunders County really picking up population from elsewhere in Nebraska. They have not done that historically. They are still negative for net migration with other states. However, they can grow pretty strong if they have a young population, so strong natural change, and then that in-migration of other Nebraskans. But again, this is sort of bucking a long-term trend where they had not been growing at all from elsewhere in Nebraska. We showed this slide a while back. It was in the news, and now we showed it again with the population estimates data. This is looking at city growth within counties, but places like Wahoo, Ashland, and Plattsmouth had not been they had been growing, but they had not been growing as particularly fast as we have seen since the decennial. And that is really explained here with this new net migration within Nebraska. And you can see some of those other outlying sort of settling, those suburb growth we're not seeing as strong as some of that exurb growth. This is a national trend that we are watching. It is a trend since the COVID-19 pandemic, where we do have more people working remotely. But if you follow any of our data, we have lots of data. As a state, we don't have a high number of folks that work entirely remote. So we probably have a lot of people that are part-time remote. And so exurbs allow for folks to still commute in on some days and then maybe have slightly larger homes or cheaper land. And so we see folks starting to move out a little bit from the suburbs to the exurbs. So this growth in those exurb counties, those outlying metro counties, is fairly new for us here in Nebraska, and something to certainly watch over the next decade, but we'll have to watch closely as things start to settle. I also wanted to point out some micropolitan counties. You saw loss to both elsewhere in Nebraska as well as other states in micropolitan counties. But I just want to point out a couple that are growing from elsewhere in Nebraska: Lincoln County, Madison County, that's North Platte, Norfolk, as well as Scottsbluff County. These are not places that have historically been growing via other people in Nebraska moving there. This is really exciting. Something to certainly watch. Kind of hard when we pool those counties together, because we do see some counties in this group. There are more counties in this group. There's 9. I'm just showing you 4, are all losing to elsewhere in Nebraska. So that negative number doesn't necessarily show that there are a few counties in that group doing really, really well. You also see Platte County grew over the last decade at a pretty significant clip, going back to that first slide that I showed. They were growing from folks elsewhere in Nebraska. They didn't in this last year, but you do see them positive on net migration with other states, which is also rare. Normally it's folks moving around Nebraska that's growing those counties, and then you tend to lose to other places. Platte County really being one county that is growing from net migration with other states. So also interesting to watch there. But a couple movers and shakers in the micropolitan counties area. Okay. So that population estimates data didn't let us do this inter-county movement thing as clearly as that ACS data does. So really interesting. We know people are moving around the state. That can kind of be confusing when we're looking at overall population numbers, because you don't see that data necessarily. And when we have people moving around the state, it doesn't really grow that overall population number, right? It's just people moving county to county. So when we see some of the county change numbers, we really have to look at those components of change, as well as get into some of that ACS data to understand what's going on. And so most of our growth is natural change, not necessarily that movement in and out. But still important to understand. And again, if we have movement in of young people, then when they have families, we can expect a little population spike out into the future. Now I want to dig in on that net domestic migration. So people move in every year from other places, people move out. This is the population estimates slide. So it's different data than we're going to look at in detail, but it gives us a really important point. The trend line is up, right? 2010, we kind of averaged this out, we were losing. Yeah, we came up a little bit in 2022, but it didn't seem like enough. Now 2023, it is negative. More people left than came in via this population estimates data, but definitely moving in the right direction. And I'll say I sort of predicted this. Since I've been here 6 years, past 2 years, I've seen so much more effort go into this topic than ever before. So right, effort doesn't always work exactly how you want, but usually can make a difference. So we've been making a lot of effort around domestic migration, and it appears to be working. The population estimates data, while negative, sort of says we've settled. We're not gaining a lot, but we're not losing a lot. I want to show it's sort of the same data point, but in ACS data, which uses the 5-year estimate. So it's going to pool a lot of data over a period of time. So it's not going to show as much movement year to year, but we can really dig into the characteristics of those movers, which we can't do in the population estimates data. So in 2023, according to the ACS 5-year data, we had 53,630 people move to different states, right? They left Nebraska, but we had 45,835 move from a different state, so come into the state. That's a net loss of 7,795 people. That is larger than that population estimates data. It has consistently been larger, but it shows the same trend, right? It was more last year, it's less this year, 7,795 with a large margin of error on it in 2023. In 2022, it was more, and it was more by a good clip, just like it is here. So we can kind of triangulate these data sources, not to get to the specific number, but to say, hey, we're moving in a really good direction here. And then we can also look at who is moving to start understanding more about what's going on in Nebraska, that more people would leave than come. But also don't forget that people do come. I think that gets lost in some of the sort of focus on people going out. So here is one you all expect from us. This is our brain drain slide. Brain drain is persons 25 years or older, their net migration rates by their level of educational attainment. And that red line is those with bachelor's degree or more. That's our brains, and that's our drain. You do see that number was consistently negative since 2010, and really that trajectory had gotten worse over time. This is the first time we've had a really nice uptick. I would call that a noticeable difference up. So yes, according to that ACS data, we did still lose people with bachelor's degrees or more, but we did not lose as many as we have in the few years prior. So that's really interesting to watch. That's really good news for a lot of reasons. I do want to point out that some college or associate's degree, we had been gainers, and we had been consistently gainers. And even last year, we gained a small number of people, but we did still gain. We lost on that number this year. More people left the state than came into the state with some college or associate's degrees. So there's something new there to watch. As a percentage of our population, 25 years and older, most of us are some college or associate's degree. I'll show you that. Only about 11% of that number is associate's degrees, so it's more some college group. So we've always been gainers on that. We had a large population that had that level of educational attainment, and we've seen that dip. We saw the dip with the high school graduate or less a while back, but we have stayed negative there. Maybe a little bit of an uptick. I would say it's kind of just a small negative trending out year to year since 2020. Those are new for us, right? We actually used to gain population from other states, and most of it was in those two groups. But now with those negative, as well as the bachelor's degree or more negative, although less negative, that's where we're still losing a lot of that population, is that bachelor's degree or more. But watching those other two as well, we are not the state we once were for folks with that level of educational attainment. They're not seeing what they saw in us going back to 2010. This is brain drain by state. The top number gives you net migration of those bachelor's degrees or more, and the bottom number gives you total outflow of those within the state. So people that moved away from the state, moved from the state, with the number of those that are bachelor's degrees or more. So that number in Nebraska, we have that negative 303,622 with a margin of error. You can round it out, but it's definitely negative. More people with bachelor's degrees left the state than came into the state. And actually, of all the people that left the state, that bottom number, about 42% of those people that left the state had bachelor's degrees or more. So close to half of those people that choose to leave are that bachelor's degrees group. And that gives it for you around that number, both of those numbers around the state. Couple interesting things to point out. Pretty similar to Iowa. Iowa bumps around on brain drain, but in 2023 looked a lot like us. Same number of exports of folks with bachelor's degrees as us. Kansas, negative. It is still brain drain, but definitely lesser. They've bumped around a little bit on that number too. South Dakota, very small, but positive. I imagine some of those are Nebraskans. Just from what I've heard contextually. We have some big brain gain states, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Arizona. Interestingly, if you look at Florida, even though they're gaining a lot of people with bachelor's degrees, they're also exporting about the same number as a percentage of population of people with bachelor's degrees out of the state. So brain gainers also do lose folks with bachelor's degrees. It's not like they keep everybody. There's a lot more dynamism to movement behavior than is captured in some of the net numbers. So I wanted you to see that. Big brain drainers, definitely also exporting a lot of folks with bachelor's degrees, places like California and Texas. I'm going to stop a minute because I am seeing some things in the chat, and I get your questions in. I'm happy to stop and talk through that. Slide about brain drain. Do you have a similar slide to those with a high school diploma or higher? We could certainly break the data down that way. I didn't do that, but reach out and we can do that. I would guess it's going to be negative if it's this plus this plus this, so we could do the math really quick. Okay. Anyway, get your questions in the Q&A and I'm happy to answer those. Another one, with some of the most populated states experiencing a large number of brain drain, I wonder how Nebraska compares to the rest of the country on a per capita basis. There's a lot of ways to slice that bottom number. I thought really hard about that. So if you have a specific question and want to see that, we can calculate that differently. Sorry, I'm just moving stuff around to be able to see the questions better. But yeah, so places like California and New York, and this is true with our data too, right? They have more population. So even though they are losing a lot of population, they still have a lot of population in the state and they are still positive for natural change. Well, pretty sure California is, not necessarily New York, but see part 1 for that data. Right, and so they are still growing, or they're just so large that losing 75,000 people with bachelor's degrees or more is not really affecting their overall population numbers in very big difference. So lots of ways to cut and slice that data to compare on migration. And right at this point, because we are now losing folks with high school graduate or less and some college or associate's degrees, we may really want to just look at total movement away from the state on a per capita basis or as a percentage of moved in or things like that. But this is showing you how many people, the percentage of folks that moved away that had bachelor's degrees or more. It's really not telling you anything about inflow, that bottom number though. So lots of different ways to cut that data. Here's the thing though. So we've been talking about brain drain in the state for a really long time. The ACS data lets us look at that data in a couple other different ways that I think don't get looked at as much. And so we focus on the educational attainment of that population. There's other things to know. And so we're going to stay with that net migration group for a little bit longer. This is net migration by age group, And I think this tells us so much. So you will see, so you're looking at mostly negatives, and you're seeing the net migration, the number, as well as the percent of that age group. So of 25 to 29-year-olds, how many net migrated out? Again, that data can be weird because do you want to use net or total flow for those percentages? But I'm just trying to structure it. And I think we're looking at it by age group here. So starting at 1 to 4-year-olds who probably move with this group of 30 to 34-year-olds. I'll tell you, if you go back, we used to lose a lot of 20 to 29. Those were bigger. So you actually see the movers are aging a little bit. They're a little bit older. We do have a positive boomerang. So 35 to 39-year-olds were net positive gainers. We're not always in every year. We always sort of talk about a boomerang, but it's not consistent year to year. 2023, we do have a net positive for what I would call that boomerang. So it's that concept of the 18 to 19-year-olds move to Lancaster County, they get degrees, they get education, then bachelor's degrees or more, leave the state in that 20 to 29-year range. We do still see a big chunk here. We see somewhat here. We did see some 18 to 19-year-olds leave. That's going to college, out of state. Let's not allow that if we can. But then we boomerang back this idea that maybe you had children or you're starting to settle down and you want to come back. So that's really exciting. Would I call that a boomerang shape? Sorry, I'm doing it on my own screen. It's a small boomerang, but it is a boomerang and it is positive. And with this numbers, I don't really get stuck on any particular number, but I'm looking at that trend and that's a positive number. So I'm going to say folks are boomeranging. We certainly could use some more in that group. We also see net positive for the 70 plus. Folks tend to stop moving. You sort of see that, right? Once they have kids, it gets harder to move, let me tell you, right? So we tend to see smaller movement in, and then you do have some boomeranging back in this age group. Might be really great healthcare we offer, or coming back to be with those 35 to 39-year-olds. So some exciting stuff happening in terms of in-migration, net in-migration in those age groups, but we are still losing that group of folks that we're worried about. And right, this certainly is after that educational attainment. So we imagine this group is pretty highly educated from that last slide as well. We can also look at it by income level. You know, I remind people that Nebraska has one of the highest rates in the country for folks with bachelor's degrees or higher that are in the labor force. So I like to imagine that when folks work in Nebraska, when they show up somewhere else, they have to work. I can do some of that in the data and confirm that for you as well. But these income levels tell us something about that too, because right, these are largely driven by earnings. So to make 75,000 or more, which we're losing a large group of, you tend to have some earnings, a job. So that's a group that we're losing. We also lose a no income group. I imagine that has a lot to do with that group of 18 to 19-year-olds moving. But this is also where you see maybe some of that high school graduate or less movement that we didn't have before that is now showing up in some of these lower age bracket, these lower wage brackets. But across these wage brackets, you do see negative migration, but the largest among that 75,000 or more. I think that definitely relates, and we'll show that to you to that brain drain slide. This is one I don't know a lot of people have seen from us. I started showing it pretty recently. This is net migration by racial and ethnic identity. Now, we are a really white state. We continue to be a really white state here in 2023. In the 5-year estimates, 76.2% of the population was white alone, not Latino, Latina. That is an ethnicity, not a racial group. So if you look at the net migration number for white alone, not Latino, Latina, that's the largest number, but I have it sorted here by the percent of net migration as a percentage of that identity group. And so Native Hawaiian is a very small number here in Nebraska, very small number of net migration, but as a percentage of that group, it's fairly large. You also see some other race alone, Black alone, Asian alone, 2 or more races actually being more likely to move as a percentage of that identity group than that group that's white alone, not Latino, Latina. Latino, Latinas were a little bit 0.3% versus 0.2% negative. So we are getting into really small numbers here as a percentage of the population. And we gained population that is Native American, that identifies as Native American. So just another interesting way to break it down. We can say that persons of color were more likely to not leave the state as a share of their population identity, but do remember these are smaller population identities in this state, so they are pretty small groups. But that tells us something interesting about who is leaving the state, those characteristics. This next slide is where people go when they leave Nebraska. I will point out this is from the 1-year data. The Census Bureau provides a really nice state migration flow table of the 1-year data because it's state data. You can use 1-year data versus 5-year data. Can't do it at that county level, so couldn't show it for all this other stuff that I've shown before, as well as some of those breakdowns. They don't release it for every different characteristic breakdown, even at the state level that we've shown, but they do make this pretty easy to use. So these numbers won't match I'm also showing overall outflow, just where Nebraskans go. I'm not showing net rates. I have that data if you're interested in where people are coming from. It looks very similar, actually. Just the overall numbers are different. But I think this should shock people, right? When people leave Nebraska, they're not going to far-flung places. They are headed to Iowa. They are headed to Colorado. They're actually headed to South Dakota and Missouri at even higher rates. I always get Texas and Arizona is where everybody thinks people are going. And certainly they do leave for those places, but actually larger numbers going right here in the region, which I think is really important to point out. And comes to this next question. So we know a lot about who's leaving the state. What we don't have is a great way to walk up to every person that leaves the state and say, hey, why'd you leave? Yet, it's sort of the question I get the most. Folks don't want the characteristics of movers. They want to know why they moved. Now, I think those two things really can be the same thing. One of the things I try to do with data from the United States Census Bureau is triangulate it, right? We're looking at population estimates. We're looking at decennial census. We're looking at this sort of deep characteristics of ACS data, but it's not polling data. So it doesn't, have those quick pop questions that you might get in a poll data. We're getting at this sort of deep level, sort of reliable data about what people are doing, but we can triangulate this data and sort of get at why we think people are moving. So what we know from that presentation is that folks tend to have a higher level of education. They tend to be in their prime workforce age years when they move. They tend to have a high income, and they tend to move somewhere in the region, which is kind of, it makes sense to me, but it might not make sense to other people. So any guesses why people move? I know this is something we all speculate about all the time. If you want to throw it in the chat or the Q&A, your thoughts on this. We have been able to use current population survey as well as do some of our own research projects to try to get at that question more directly. And I pulled some of that data. But when I look at highly skilled, high income earners moving, even without knowing very specifically if they're employed or not, I gotta know that they're employed. So in this 2023 data, definitely see job opportunities and jobs being a driving factor. So I wanted to look at some of that workforce data for you to kind of get at solving this puzzle without actually having some of the very specific survey data. If you've seen some of our infographics, we have used current population survey data in the past, as well as our own survey projects to get at this, and jobs do tend to be a leading factor. It just doesn't, unfortunately, answer every question. This is the 2023 5-year estimates. These are occupations. All of those little dots are things Nebraskans do. And across our horizontal axis, we have the number of people that work at those jobs. So we have a high number of people working in office and administrative support. Close to 120,000 people work in those jobs. We actually have less than 20,000 people working in farming, fishing, and forestry. Those numbers are accurate. Go ask a farmer. They actually think those numbers are a little high. A lot of our land and a lot of our GDP is dedicated to agriculture, but it doesn't take that many people to work in that industry, to work in that occupation group. So that's how occupations break down based on how many people work in them. And then on my vertical axis, I have the median income in those occupations. Remember, it's a median. So people make a really high wage in computer and math, and people make a really low wage in food prep and serving related. I can get this. So then I put a red line here at the median earnings for workers, which is 42,700 in 2023. And I put it at the median for the number of people that work in those. And so you end up with these 4 quadrants. So for instance, a high wage in computer, math, architecture, and engineering, and legal, low number of people working in it. That computer and math, that was interesting towards that median, which is really exciting. Compare that to, for instance, low number of people, low wage, high number, low wage, high number, high wage. We have more people that work down here than work up here. So we have more people working below the median for all wages than we do above the median for all wages, which means we are driven by low wage work. Our economy, most of our people are employed in that lower wage work. That surprises a lot of people, I think, but it definitely puts some of who's leaving and why they're leaving in context for us. And we'll keep talking about that. But I want to show how it really shows up in other data sources as well. This is fairly recent from the Nebraska Department of Labor. This is advertised jobs by occupation. If you're not using any works from the Nebraska Department of Labor, you are missing out on some great data. Yes, this is job scraping. So it does not include every job that is possibly open. Actually, this number just ticked below 30,000 open jobs for the first time in a really long time, but it's like at 29,000. So it didn't tick down much. But yes, we have open jobs in Nebraska, and these are where they are. Registered nurse, a high wage job. They are in the health diagnosing and treating group. There's also health tech, which is a little bit lower wage. Here they are, but registered nurses are in that. And then retail sales. That's a low wage job that we have, a lot of out in here. Licensed practical and licensed vocational nurses, that nursing assistants, that's tech. Teaching assistants, not the higher wage registered teachers, but the lower wage. Then you have general and operations managers. We have a lot of people in management, a lot of jobs open. That makes sense to me. Physicians, a lot of jobs open, a lot of need, health diagnosing and treating, but then first line supervisors of retail sales and customer service representatives. So you see the number of jobs open reflecting this, right? It tends to be over in here and down in here, right? Couple in here and then a bunch down in here, which is kind of interesting, right? We are driven by low wage work. We have low wage jobs open, as well as healthcare. And that's a national trend as well. As we have an aging population, which we discussed in part 1, we will have an increasing need for healthcare. So it really reflects our current, the jobs that are open really reflects the kind of jobs we have here in Nebraska today. What you don't see on this top 10 list is some of these. And that's not surprising to me. Are there jobs in computer and math? Absolutely. There are jobs, there are open jobs, but it's not a top 10 in open jobs. We don't have a lot of people working in them. Why would we expect a lot of open jobs? This is median earnings for workers across the state. As with everything in Nebraska, our median can really obscure what's going on throughout the state because we have such large differences in population and the type of work people do across the state. So our median at 42,700, you see in these metro counties tend to be beating that median, but you see lots of counties around the state below that median. That's not just telling you what people earn, it's telling you what people do as well. And so even that map of occupations, there's going to be fewer. If we're driven by low wage work across the state, we're driven by even lower wage work out of those metro counties where you see those higher wages. You also see a mix too, right? Because in larger counties where there's a lot of people working in high wage work, they use a lot of services, which tends to be lower wage work. But here's that median broken down by state for the 2023 5-year. You can't do this with 2023 1-year estimates. So this is why this is exciting. We really get to see how this stuff plays out across the state. Now, when we look at those occupations that are high wage, for instance, health diagnosing and treating practitioners, they probably have a bachelor's degree or more. Legal, they probably have a bachelor's degree or more. Computer and math, they do probably have a bachelor's degree or more. I always get, well, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't. He's not in this data, is my comment on that. So you see a really clear pattern between educational attainment, which we talked about with brain drain, and median earnings. So as wages increase, earnings increase, and it's pretty clear, and actually it's stronger than the 2022 numbers and explains, I think, even more of that brain drain. But so here's our breakdown. These gray bars are the percent of the population 25 years or older by each level of educational attainment. This number of less than high school graduates is going down compared to other years. Well, these numbers are coming up, which is really exciting. We are getting more skills. We are getting to higher levels of educational attainment as a state. Still not very competitive nationally on the number that's bachelor's degree or higher. Most of us are in the some college group, a little over that 22.2%, because it's only about 11% that have an associate's degree. I will say earnings jump at the associate's degrees level, but just to give you that breakdown, since that's a smaller number, we have a lot of confidence in these. This high school graduate to some college or associate's degree line used to be a little more direct up. Not sure if I'm going the right way for you all. But it was more of a linear trend than this kind of broken linear trend we have now. Saying with each level of educational attainment, there was a really good jump. And it's this jump that is lessening between the high school graduate to some college or associate's degree. And this jump is increasing. So going back, this was in 2022 even, but if you go back to 2018, this jump was more, and now this jump is increasing and this jump is lessening. So people are needing to earn more degrees, higher skill to make more wages than in the past. It used to be a really good jump here, and now it's a little bit lesser. Still a jump, it is increasing, but it's lesser than in the past, which is really telling you a lot about how occupations are moving into the future as well. So this is that relationship to earnings and wages that it referred to a little bit when I looked at those characteristics. We knew they were bachelor's degrees leaving the state. We now know there's 75,000 plus leaving the state. So really, they're in these groups earning high wages at high skill levels. This is who tends to leave. And when we jump back here to this, we get a really good sense of the occupations. In previous years, I've shown who leaves the state by occupation using different, using microdata. It's not a standard table, but I will have that available eventually when the 5-year data is released through the microdata site. This is so now we know high skill, high wage jobs are related. This is showing you that they're also high demand jobs. This is the percent change in number of persons employed by occupation 2018 to 2023. The BLS this summer released projections about occupation growth over time. They go a decade out, and actually people really don't trust it, which is funny because folks want us to project things 100 years out. I'm like, wow, if the BLS can't do it, I definitely can't do it. But different topic. So this isn't projecting out. This is just the change between 2018 and 2023 using ACS 5-year data for both points in time. And you see a really clear relationship. So I put the high wage jobs above the median in red and the low wage jobs in gray. And you see those high wage jobs are growing, and they're growing fast. So wait, why isn't that showing up as, lots of jobs being open in computer and math? They're growing, and they're growing fast, but they're growing faster other places, and we don't have a ton of density of them right now, which is what you see in this map. So our top number is the percent change in the highest wage jobs, 60,000 plus, computer, math, architecture and engineering, health, diagnosing, management, legal. And then the bottom number is our density. What percentage of our total workforce is in there? Our density is not terrible, especially compared in the region, but it's not particularly high. But our percent change, even though those are the ones that are growing and growing fast compared to our low wage, they are growing faster in other places Colorado, 15%. You look at even Wyoming, they have lower density to start, but they're growing them faster. Missouri, Texas, some of those coastal states that we saw some population going to, also gaining those jobs faster. So triangulating that data, not even looking at that current population survey data or that other survey data we've collected where we ask people, hey, why'd you leave? And we get told job opportunities is a major driver. They're high skill, they're high wage, they're high demand. They're just in higher demand elsewhere. And this is classic economics, right? Supply and demand. When you want a lot of those workers, what are you willing to do? You're willing to pay a little bit more, maybe offer a slightly different culture or quality of life, workplace life, and so they become a little bit more competitive to attract those workers. So when folks are leaving the state in 2023, all of those characteristics, as well as those workforce characteristics, really indicate to me it's coming back to job opportunities. I did jump on the current population survey to look at that data. That data is incomplete. For instance, it doesn't ask, did you leave because of taxes, which is sort of the pushback I get when I try to use that data. And we've also seen housing, which is our next topic, be important in that data and a driver of growth. But in 2023 and even into 2024, because they have monthly data, we are seeing job opportunities as being, again, a main reason why folks left the state. So, and it's making a lot of sense to me based on that set of data we just looked at. Okay, so that was insight into our next topic, housing. This is a comparative profile of housing, just a couple of different housing data points. If you go back to part 1, I did look at the comparative profiles CP, if you want to search it in data.census.gov, of the 1-year data, just to give you a sense of what numbers are on the move statewide. In the comparative profiles with the 5-year data, you get a much longer arc. So you're much more likely to see those statistically significant changes over time, as we do in that 5-year data. But I wanted to point out, even in the 1-year data, when it comes to the value of what people are paying to live, those numbers are increasing both in owner occupied and median gross rent. But this is just to give you a sense of 2022 to 2023, and then here essentially 2018 to 2023, but using the 5-year data, how things have changed over time in the housing area. Like I said, we have done some research going back, looking at other survey data to explain why people leave the state, and housing has always sort of been part of the mix. It's a complicated reason why people leave. That's why I think most people, when they leave in the region. That means they can have a better job, maybe cheaper housing, but also see grandparents over the holidays. If you move to Iowa, you can still drive back here to Nebraska. So triangulating a lot of that data, but housing is definitely part of that story. And like I said, we're seeing some housing data on the move, higher occupancy rates, lower vacancy rates, but also increases in the cost of those. I want to put that in some context with other states, because again, we tend to be sort of in the middle. Our median value of owner-occupied housing of $223,800 was a 24% increase, a statistically significant increase from 2018. That number is not that high compared to other states. It's pretty high in the region, just looking at this bottom number, higher than the median value in Iowa, Kansas. It's lower than South Dakota. That number's jumped. Certainly lower than Colorado, lower than Wyoming. But even if you stretch out a little bit, you see it's okay, it's lower, it's higher. But our 24.4% increase, and that doesn't inflation adjust or anything, is a much larger increase than, guess where people are going? Iowa, Kansas. It's even higher than South Dakota. I was tracking these monthly from a different source, particularly coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we had seen valuations rise really fast. So I've been tracking that for a while, and I'm actually shocked that we're beating South Dakota in this ACS data. So you do see some really large increases in some places, but our 24.4% increase is pretty large. Now, that's not inflation adjusted. I just did some work for the planning committee of the state legislature where we looked at valuations, but we looked at them adjusted. It's still total valuation increase across the state, even inflation adjusted over a slightly larger time frame was still about 84%, but it's a much larger time frame. But so these numbers are not inflation adjusted, but this, when you're comparing to other states' increases over the same period of time, these are real increases. So owner-occupied units, while not extremely expensive in comparison to other states, have jumped up a lot in the state. Like I said, you can compare it to other states, or you can CPI adjust it, and you're still seeing, wow, that's a jump. And I think that really matters. Those jumps are across the state as well. Now here we had a couple negative counties, so I put those in red because those are really the outliers. Look at some of the increases. 80%, 80%, 45%, 57%, 66%. Now their numbers are lower than our median for the state in a lot of these places, but the increases have been great. Now remember, this in sort of property tax parlance, this isn't, we have property tax increases as well, but this is valuation increase, what the home value is, which also drives some of those property tax increases. I'll tell you in that work for the planning committee, which I don't have for you here just because it's different, it's a different set of data. But when we account for credits and inflation adjustment, property taxes have only risen about 35%, while property tax valuations, inflation adjusted, and this is 2003 to 2023, so longer time period too, was 84%. So valuations, the cost of housing, what it costs to buy housing, is increasing faster than those property taxes. So I'm really thinking it's housing cost, which does account for some of that property taxes, but not really. It's that valuation that's driving those big increases. And a lot of what you're hearing about housing is really this obvious increase across the state and compared to other states in the value of our owner-occupied housing units. Just jump back to here. You also see increases in the median value of gross rent going up as well, which we understand to be true. Like they own it, they pass that, those increases in ownership costs on to the renters. So I'm not trying to not talk about renters here, but you see these big increases in both groupings. I think that's pretty surprising jumps. I think that's pretty surprising jumps compared to the region. Housing is expensive. So I wanted to talk about this in the context of mapping a little bit. In part one, some folks said that they had not used data.census.gov to do some mapping. And I've gotten a lot of questions where people, this is a real question in my inbox from a very smart, wonderful person that wanted to know more about housing in their area. So can you tell me about home ownership in Douglas County? They had a hypothesis that the western portion of the county has higher home ownership rates than the eastern portion of the county. They were actually trying to look up this number directly in the mapping feature of data.census.gov, which is tip number one, don't do that. Don't do that. So you're gonna, if you want to use the mapping feature in data.census.gov, which I do think is a wonderful feature, and you should try to use it if you are a data user, I want to give you some tips to make it easier. Do not jump straight to maps. It is very hard to find data in the maps. It is much easier to map in maps. So you're going to find your data first. So a couple tips I've given you in the past. There are a few different DP tables that can be they're a really good indicator of what's available in the ACS. You have the demographic, social, housing, and economic. Most of the data that is available in the ACS you get a real key that it's available through these DP tables, and they can be a lot easier, in my opinion, in my experience, than searching the way data.census.gov tells you to search, which is just to kind of use it like Google, but their search terms and my search terms are different. So you're going to put DP in your search bar. I went to housing characteristics. They told me they were interested in home ownership. And I searched through this table to find owner occupied and renter occupied. I also went and made sure you use the 5-year estimates. Now, Douglas County is available through the 1-year estimates, but I know we're going to look sub-county level. That's never going to be available in the 1-year estimates in our much smaller state than most. It has to be 65,000 population plus. Data.census.gov defaults to the 1-year, defaults to the 1-year. You will get so frustrated thinking data you think is available is not available. Make sure you're on the 5-year estimates. It frustrates me too. Now, I did not choose a geo here because I knew I was going to go into maps. You can choose a geo, and when you switch over into maps, it'll bring you right to that geo. But my experience is that in the maps feature, they have what they call layer versus geo, which actually shows you the different geographies available. And it's nice. It's an image. You can scroll here. You get a real sense of what's available geographically now. They're going to show you layers that are not available for all data points. So it shows block group here. Block group's not available for ACS, even 5-year. But you do get a sense of what's available in this layer feature versus going directly to the geo on the table. But always find your data on the table, have that table up before you switch into maps versus going into maps and then trying to search for data. You really can't do it. So I went in, I'm going to choose county because he said Douglas County, which is already a hint it's wrong, but that's okay. And then you have the select feature. So I just choose the layer and it doesn't show me anything but counties across the United States. But then when you come into that view, you select, and what's really nice is you click and grab, and you can grab multiple counties and start to do some analysis, right? Because in order to know what's going on in Douglas County, you really have to have some comparison points. So I started with county, and then I used the select tool. Like I said, if you just chose county and geo on the table, geo is for geography, it would just go to Douglas County. You could still use the select feature to add more counties, but again, I think it's more interesting to have that option to start putting things in contrast right away. So I like to find my data point, go into the layer, choose a layer, and then select. It gives you more options. Then you have to come up to here and adjust to your data point. Again, it may reset when you look at different views. So you might have to go to this feature again, the way it goes to that. We have someone with a raised hand. If you could put your question in the Q&A, and I know it's more difficult to write things out. It's just a little hard to find people and allow them to talk. So if you could put it in the Q&A, if not, when I get to the end, I will try to find you and let you talk. Okay, so this gives you a view. Douglas County, 61.7% are owner occupied. But again, they wanted to look at east-west. If I actually look at this compared to other counties in the region, this number looks lower owner occupied. My scale is down here. You can move it around a little bit, but you can't make it very pretty. This happens a lot in analysis. People say a geography, but they don't really mean that geography, right? This person doesn't really want to know about Douglas County. They want to know inside Douglas County. This is another reason why I like to use layers, because I can start to see, oh, wow, these are the different geographies I can use. So I went ahead and went back to layer, and I chose Zip code tabulation areas, which definitely gives me sub-Douglas County. I'll tell you, if you see this gray line that shows me Douglas County, to get that, I went to boundaries and added, it's kind of light here, but the county line. Because once you choose zip codes, the layer, it shows you zip codes, but I want to see zip codes inside of Douglas County, which maybe y'all are smarter than me and knew the boundary really easily, but now I can add that boundary to help my analysis. So is it true East Douglas County has lower home ownership rates than West? Absolutely. There's a pretty clear pattern. So darker is higher. I know that's hard to see, but these are lighter, a little lighter. And as we go out, it gets a little darker. You also see a north-south pattern if you wanted to talk about that. But adding that boundaries of county helps me to see zip code. Could also do this by census tracts. Once you kind of got everything settled and you're like, yeah, this is what I want to look like, or this is what I'm looking at, data point and geography, then you might want to start messing with some of these other features, these more tools. If you're in full screen mode, you'll see them all. And I think people start clicking on those a little too early. Don't focus there first. Get your data point and your geography. Here, I went ahead and added a different base map. I do find the streets can sometimes be really helpful, as well as those boundaries to kind of know where I am in a place. I changed the color. Doesn't really matter. You can even change the groupings here through classes. I don't suggest doing that. Maps is smart. It's giving you classifications that are useful. Here I flipped over to renter occupied. If owner occupied had that east-west pattern, I should see that same east-west pattern in this as well. So that's a little bit about housing and mapping together. And that is what I have for you today, but I know you all have questions. So get those in. I'm happy to answer them. Of course, I just got rid of my question thing somehow. There we go. Okay. I have a question here about the different age groups. Please go over findings of single year, single age group population like this. For single year of age, you are going to want to use population estimates, not ACS, is the answer to that question. And sorry, I think I didn't handle that right. And I said I would type an answer. But the question was about looking at data by age groups. So going back, for instance, we looked at net migration by age group way back here. And I haven't broke, these smaller age groups. If you want single year of age, you probably want to use population estimates data that makes that readily available versus ACS data. So Jennifer had a question, and I can try to find her if you want to talk instead of write it in. Oh, I could use the search. Okay, Jennifer, I'm allowing you to talk. If you'd like to ask a question. Or I think you're unmuted, can you? No. Okay, if you want to type it or come back later, you certainly can. Other questions? We have a couple minutes before we take our first break, so happy to take those. No? Wild. Y'all are usually full of questions. Okay, then I think what we can do is take our break now. And if you do have questions over the break, and I know this, like, the slides are already out and you want to put those, here we go. Now people are coming. Yesterday, I pulled the 2023 5-year estimates for poverty status and notice what looks like a significant difference between my previous data set, which came from the 2021 5-year ACS, specifically used S1701. Yep. Have you noticed the same difference? Poverty levels seem to have dropped. Yeah. I didn't look too much at the poverty data for this. I did see it in the 1 year. You can, as long as you're comparing 5-year to 5-year, then you are okay. Sometimes you want to look outside of a 5-year group to really say that, wow, that's a big difference. And we should look at it on the comparative profiles table because that'll tell us if it's significant as well. But yeah, poverty had for a long time been dropping. Then actually, like we have some mixed signals during 2020 because people did have more income due to different government benefits. So then we saw like a drop, but we didn't expect it to necessarily continue. Generally, we have Dustin's going to talk about the economy later today, but generally we have been seeing actually a fairly strong economy despite a lot of what people say. It depends on the metric you're using, but yeah, that's been looking that way to me, and I'm happy to look at it a little bit more with you, the poverty data. These are some of the big ones we present every year, so I wanted to get this data out first, but we usually do a poverty infographic every year, so we'll be looking at that with the 5-year data really soon. And looking at, that's another thing, the statewide numbers are probably going to look better than a lot of the specific county numbers too, so something to check there. Other questions? Okay, so plan now is to take a bit of a break. If you do have questions over the break, you can put them in the Q&A. Either I'll answer later or might have some time to come back live with you before the end of the day, but we will definitely take them all and get them answered at some point. Going to take a break, and then we'll be back at 10:45 with Adam from the United States Census Bureau. He's going to be talking about some of the economic data sources, and then Dustin on the economy too. We have another poverty question. Update 5-year ACS data of children by county that are under the age of 3 that are below 2% of the federal poverty level. Where do I start? People with this poverty data, everybody just be picking numbers. Actually, I think 190% is really available, and for some reason 200 isn't. So we'll record that question, Jamie, and I will send you a link to that data so you can start working on it. But yes, a lot of that poverty data needs to be with 5-year data, especially by county. So that is now available. We'll record that, and I'll send you a link to get you started a lot faster than if I tried to remember the table number right now. Okay, we're going to take that break for real. Put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be back at 10:45. Thank you all so much for this morning and listening to my voice for so long.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back from our break. We are excited to have Adam Grundy with us. He is a supervisory statistician with the U.S. Census Bureau, and he's going to share with us today a brief overview of some of the U.S. Census Bureau resources that are available to describe the economy, and then also how to access some of those data resources. So thanks for joining us, Adam, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the invite for this great organization. So my name is Adam Grundy. I'm a supervisory statistician in the Economic Directorate. I'm much more of an outreach specialist. I do a lot of trade shows, conferences, webinars, and those type of things in order to spread the word about our economic data. So this is how we're structured in the Census Bureau for the Economic Directorate. So basically, you can think of the way we're structured as more like a pyramid. So at the top of our pyramid is our high frequency data. These would be things like our business trends and outlook survey, which comes out on like more of like a pulse for getting a general flavor of what's going on in the economy. And then we have our monthly and quarterly small sample surveys as you move down the pyramid. So things such as like the M3, which provides the durable goods orders that you hear about in the news. So, for example, if you hear in the news that durable goods orders for the month of April, let's just say, for example, went up 4%, that's actually coming from the Census Bureau, from the Economic Directorate, from our economic indicators. And then we have our annual surveys, which have larger sample sizes, and they provide the most up-to-date trend data available. This would be things like the annual survey of manufacturers, annual retail trade survey, and a new exciting survey that I'll tell you about towards the end of our presentation called the Annual Integrated Economic Survey. And that combines 7 of our annual surveys into one major survey. And then we have our comprehensive censuses. We have 2 censuses in the Economic Directorate. The main one is the economic census, which we're currently in the 2022 economic census cycle. And then we also have the census of governments going on during those 5-year cycles as well. And then at the bottom of our pyramid is our foundational administrative data that helps us supplement a lot of our annual programs and surveys, much like the county business patterns and the non-employer statistics program. So this is a little bit more about how we're structured and with our data. So first of all, the economic data is structured on a NAICS basis, or North American Industry Classification System, which is our primary data dimension. So you can see on the right-hand side is a NAICS hierarchy for how the NAICS codes work. So basically, if you start at the sector level or the 2-digit level, you have a very broad category of information. As you move down by adding more digits to a NAICS code, you get much more specific all the way down to a U.S. industry, which is a 6-digit NAICS code of radio stations. So that's just one example for that. So basically, the main takeaway for this is that as you add more digits to a NAICS code, you get much more specific, but there's less data available. So we recommend starting at basically either the sector level for one, and then moving down to the industry group or the 4-digit NAICS, and then continue your way down to see if there's more data available at those levels. So I'll also talk a little bit about establishments versus companies and firms. An establishment is a single physical location of a business, whereas a company and firm could have multiple establishments within it. So if we give the example of, let's say, the fictional company of Adam's Bakery, that has 5 establishments in the state of Maryland, where I'm from. So it would be one company, but 5 establishments, a big example for that. We also have employers versus non-employers. So most of our programs only cover employer establishments or people with paid employees, but we also have a non-employer statistics program, which covers all the self-employed individuals. So this is about our key economic surveys and programs. So at the top, we have one of my favorite programs called the County Business Patterns. This covers all the employer businesses in the United States. It allows us to supply great infographics that we see like on the left-hand side about breweries as they go up each year. So this one I actually put together in our outreach area for showing how the number of breweries in the United States actually went up each year from starting from 2019 all the way to the most current vintage of the data, which is 2022. And then non-employer statistics, these cover all the non-employer businesses or businesses with no paid employees. And they use in most all sectors of the economy, non-employers will far outweigh the number of employer establishments in the United States. So some examples of non-employers would be like taxi and limousine services. We also have a lot of home daycares, and we also have things such as couriers, and we also have tons of different categories for non-employers that make up a big part of what we call the gig economy. So people working multiple jobs or doing other side jobs to make ends meet. And then another part of our key economic surveys and programs is the annual business survey. This covers employer businesses in the United States. It includes great data about our business owners themselves. So if you're looking for information about the number of Asian-owned restaurants in the state of Nebraska, the annual business survey would be your best bet for that. If you're looking for the number of veteran-owned, let's say, daycares in the state of California, annual business survey could tell you that as well. And then we have our economic census, which is the main breadwinner, so to speak, for the economic directorate, which provides the official 5-year measure of American businesses. And this provides comprehensive statistics at the national, state, and also local levels. It's a little bit more about that. It's conducted every 5 years, basically every year ending with the digit 2 or 7. So we're currently in the 2022 economic census cycle. It was conducted 100% online when we were collecting data for it, and the response was required by law for the businesses that were selected for the economic census. The responses are 100% confidential. We're required by law to keep all that information private and secure, lifetime sworn status once you work at the Census Bureau. So in another life, I used to be a 4th grade teacher before I worked at the Census Bureau, but if I ever went back to teaching, I couldn't tell anybody about who's in our surveys or programs. So that's another key part of that makes people secure with sharing the great data for the Census Bureau, submitting their data to the Census Bureau, I should say. And there's about 4 million business locations covering most industries and geographic areas in the economic census. And they will receive surveys tailored to their primary business activity, whether they be a manufacturing plant, a retail location, a wholesaler, or things like that. We have industry-specific questions. And the results are starting to come out, and they're free and online. So this is what the release schedule looks like. So we're currently in the geographic area statistics release, which came out December 5th, so a couple days ago. That was originally going to be out in February of 2025, but we've accelerated the release schedule for a lot of these different releases to make sure that we get the data out in a timely manner. So you can see the next release coming up is going to be our bridge and comparative releases. Both of those are scheduled for February of 2025, with followed by the establishment and firm size statistics in June of 2025. Product statistics tells us a lot about the great product data that each of the businesses produce. That'll be in September, and we have releases going all the way until March of 2026. A little bit more about the public sector, a census of governments. We have 5 surveys that provide economic statistics about state and local governments. And these surveys are really our public sector counterpart, the private sector data. And while the response is voluntary, there's virtually no confidentiality restriction because the data is public record. So we have different things such about tax revenue. We have data on state and local governments and things like that. So it allows us to produce cool statistics that are basically public record that we can repackage in a way that makes sense for our data users. And then I mentioned before in the beginning, we have our new big annual integrated economic survey, which combines 7 of our current annual surveys into one. So each of these surveys that you see on the middle of your screen, the service annual survey, all the way down to manufacturer's unfilled order survey, have all been sunset into the annual integrated economic survey. So there's a little bit more about this here. This provides multiple benefits to respondents, data users, and stakeholders. So we're trying to reduce respondent burden by usually when these companies get multiple surveys, we try to reduce the burden by finding ways we can ask the same questions or similar questions in a way that reduces the burden on those actual survey respondents. So this is one of the ways we're doing that. And this will allow us to produce timely, accurate, and relevant statistics and increase operational efficiencies that you can see below. So basically, this is the timeline for the annual integrated economic survey. The initial mail was in March 15th of this year. The due date was April 30th, and the collection actually closed out on Halloween of this year. So we can expect data from the annual integrated economic survey in July of next year. And this, if you want to stay in tune to everything going on with the AIES, we have the URL on the slide as well. So of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the great data for the state of Nebraska too. So I mentioned before, County Business Patterns allows us to produce data on breweries. So this one gives you a quick little data profile on data.census.gov, which is a site within the Census Bureau's website or census.gov. that shows the number of breweries in the state of Nebraska. So if you look down here, you see there's 30 employer establishments, but there might be some non-employers too. So people that have no paid employees as well. But this one gives you a quick snapshot of everything going on in the state of Nebraska. And then we also have a new data visualization from the county business patterns. The URL is down here below. And basically what this does is it highlights on different counties within the state of Nebraska and other states in the United States, the number of establishments, number of employees, annual payroll, and I believe one other category that I can't remember at the top of my head, but from the county business patterns, from all the way from a 2-digit or sector level all the way down to a 6-digit national U.S. industry. So you can see the blue bubbles over here are data from the selected industry, which is number of establishments. So you can see in this particular county, there's where most of the business activity is going on. And then the yellow circle is for the data is not available for some industries. So there's certain ones for county business patterns that it does not capture, but I encourage you to play around with this URL, and I'd be happy to address any questions that you have while you do that or after the fact too. So this brings us next to the Q&A.
Thank you, Adam. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A right now and we can answer them live. You're talking about bakeries and breweries, so you got my head elsewhere. I'm all excited for the holidays
Nice.
now, especially. Also, I noticed the jump from 4th grade teacher to supervisory statistician. That's quite a jump. So,
Yes.
not necessarily questions to be answered in this forum. But thank you for joining us today, Adam. I think even those of us who do this work all the time don't even realize how much data is actually out there and available on the Census Bureau website. So thanks for showing us a little bit of that in action, especially in the Nebraska context.
Sure thing, not a problem.
Okay, I think we're going to transition to our next presentation as well. And that is Dr. Dusty White, who is getting promoted. There we go. Okay. Well, thanks, Adam, for joining us. We really appreciate your time and happy holidays to you. Hi, Dusty. Welcome. We're so excited to have you with us. So Dr. Dustin White is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at UNO. Dr. White earned his Ph.D. in economics from Washington State University and his BA in economics from Brigham Young University. His primary focus areas are health and labor economics, sports economics, and industrial organization, and data analytics broadly. Some of Dr. White's other interests include machine learning and data analysis, and he also is really committed to helping students stay engaged in the learning process by incorporating projects from sports or some of these other areas of popular culture into his courses. So thanks for joining us today, Dusty, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks so much. I lost the unmute button there for a second.
No problem.
So thanks for letting me come and share some information with you about the national and local economy. Looking forward to it. It's not something I often get to talk about, so kind of a fun thing to talk about. So one of the big things that I see in conversations around around the country really are questions about whether or not we're headed for a recession. People always want to know that. And then there's been a lot of discussion of a soft landing, which honestly, I don't think was a term that people used in the public domain really until recently. And so it's been a conversation since COVID, but I think it's one of those things that we could use some definition, understand how it applies to stuff. And what we're really looking at when we talk about a recession versus soft landing as we look forward into the coming year. So a recession is something that I think most people kind of have a general idea of what it means. But a recession is defined as when we have negative GDP growth for consecutive quarters. An interesting thing about this is that it means that we don't actually know we're in a recession until we're into a recession, right? Because we have to see 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth before we can confirm that we're in a recession. So lots of signs can be there for a recession before the government will say, yes, we're in a recession. So sometimes it makes them look a little slow to say that, but it's because the definition requires them to observe 2 quarters of negative growth first. But when we see a recession, things that we also see besides negative GDP growth are going to be things like higher than typical unemployment, right? So you often see unemployment rise. You see low and declining wages and prices. So basically, because there's higher unemployment, you're going to see downward pressure on people's wages, and so you're going to see low wage growth. People who are trying to sell goods and services are going to be trying to stimulate more purchases, and so they're going to do that by lowering the prices of their goods or services in order to try and convince people to pay for those things. We also see poor stock market performance as we look at a recession. Overall, what we really see, though, is that recessions happen when people lose confidence in the direction of the economy, right? All of these things are basically results of people lacking confidence to spend or consume. So on the business side, when you see a company that lacks confidence, they might lay people off or not hire new employees. They're going to be less willing to pay more for employees. And people who are not confident in the economy or, are going to be trying to save more and consume less. And so it's going to be hard to convince them, not hard for them necessarily, but hard to convince them to spend money on goods or services. And so that's what leads to poor business performance, and these things kind of feed off of each other. And so you see these kind of feedback cycles leading to recessions. So when you see a lack of confidence, it often leads to recessions. Uh, when we're looking at entering into a recession, we'll often see inflation outpacing wage growth. So prices will be rising faster than wages, which is one of the ways that people can lose confidence in the direction of the economy. Again, we talked about job openings. Companies are going to be less comfortable hiring more people. Housing demand is another way that people have confidence or not have confidence. When life is good, we think about upgrading our living accommodations, which means either buying a house for the first time, buying a new house. But if we lack confidence in the economy, we're not going to be doing that, right? If I'm not sure if I'm going to be laid off soon, I'm not going to go buy a new house, right? I'm going to try and find ways to save money and protect myself from uncertainty. On the other hand, a soft landing is it's a deceleration in the economy, but without entering into recession. So what we can think of in terms of a soft landing is that the economy goes in cycles, right? So we have expansionary and contractionary periods in the economy. When we have an expanding economy, we see lots of growth in productivity. We see growth in wages. We see all sorts of increases in consumption, all that stuff. A soft landing would be when we're coming out of one of these expansionary periods and we have the economy slow down, but not slow down so much that people have lost confidence and the GDP falls into negative growth. So, what is the conversation then as we talk about COVID? Uh, so, in order to, so basically, let's step back and remember all the things that happened. I'm sure we all want to relive that, right? But during COVID, because people were not going out, right, in order to minimize infection rates, people were not going out and eating. People were not going on vacations. People were basically shut in at home, right? And so what that means is that in order to try and stimulate the economy, because people were getting laid off, because basically services were not being demanded almost all, right? Many different kinds of services were in very low demand. And so firms were laying people off because they couldn't pay employees during a time when there was no demand. Um, Obviously, that leads to a very reasonable loss of confidence on the part of consumers, right, who are not sure if they'll be the next one to be laid off. And so the government actually injected huge amounts of stimulus into the economy with good reason, right? Trying to make sure that this pandemic did not um, totally destroy people's ability to buy food and have a house and all of these important things that we need. And so by doing that, though, in combination with the fact that it was hard to get stuff because shipping was slowing down because of the pandemic, what ended up happening was that demand was much higher than firms' ability to provide goods, which led to a strong inflationary surge, which means that prices jumped very quickly, right? Prices went up, and they went up because there weren't as many goods as people wanted to consume. And so as we came out of the pandemic, inflation was high and employment was returning to normal. Um, what the federal government wanted to do, though, was bring inflation back down, right? Obviously, you don't want high inflation indefinitely, and so you're willing to tolerate it under extreme circumstances, but you want to rein it back in. And so what ended up happening next was that the federal government increased their interest rates that they charge to businesses in order to try and reduce inflation. What that also does, though, is it slows down the economy. And so the question really was, can we figure out what inflation rate the government needs to target, or sorry, what interest rate the government needs to target in order to bring the inflation rate back down to where we want it to be? The federal government tends to target about 2% inflation as an ideal inflation because you want a little bit of inflation, but not a ton. And so, in order to try and target that 2% rate that they wanted to have over the long run, they increased short-term interest rates to try and rein in inflation. But when you're doing that, you don't know if you're going to increase interest rates too much and create a recession. It's very hard to know exactly what interest rate you should be charging in order to target that soft landing. And so all the conversation about soft landing is about the Federal Reserve banks trying to figure out if they can correctly determine the interest rates that will bring inflation down while not creating a recession, right? So not sending us into this lack of confidence environment that you see on the left-hand side of the slide. And so what they're trying to do is increase interest rates in order to decrease inflation without slowing economic growth so much that the economy enters a recession. For historical examples, a soft landing was achieved in the mid 90s. On the other side, though, the last time we saw a really big round of inflation was actually in the late 70s, early 80s, right? And so during this period of what they call stagflation, interest rates were very high, and so was inflation. But the interest rate was actually increased significantly and very quickly in order to stop inflation. And so these recessions that happened afterwards, it was not a soft landing, right? So there's actually some recessions in the late 70s, early 80s called the Volcker recessions. And they're named for the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank because he increased interest rates to the point that it caused recessions, but with the goal of reining in inflation so that over the long term there wouldn't be runaway excuse me, there wouldn't be runaway inflation. And so over time, we've hit and we've missed on these soft landings. Sometimes we manage to achieve them, sometimes we don't. We overshoot and we generate recessions. And so it's a very hard balance to strike. But that's what we're always talking about in terms of, is there going to be a recession? Is there going to be a soft landing? Ideally, we'd be able to use things like interest rates to prevent recessions by being able to increase or decrease those interest rates in order to stimulate or cool off the economy, depending on whether it's running hot or cold. So, what are we going to talk about for the rest of this talk? We're going to go through some of the different indicators that point us toward either recessions or soft landings. So on the national scale, we're going to look at things like GDP. We're going to look at income and consumer spending, inflation rates, interest rates, and then we're going to dive closer into the Omaha metro area. And we'll talk about what things look like here locally. So how's the business cycle doing? What does our local inflation look like? How does it compare to the national rate? What is our jobs and unemployment situation? What are sales doing? And then we'll go into some forecasts of what might be reasonable to expect in the near future. Now, obviously, if we knew, we'd be able to do all sorts of cool stuff, like, invest really well in the stock market. So these aren't guarantees of what's going to happen, but we're going to talk about what some reasonable scenarios are for the coming year. And if you have questions, please, please, please do put them in the chat. I'd love to see what you want to focus on. So start off with this, though. We're going to look at GDP over time and look at inflation and unemployment. So here on this graph, we've got two different lines. The blue one is the real GDP potential, and the orange one is real GDP. So real GDP is the inflation-adjusted measure of how much output the United States is generating. So this is a U.S. level graph, and so over here on the side, you can see that GDP is somewhere in the low $20 trillion per year, and has grown significantly over the last 15 years. So when we look at this graph, though, the real GDP is the actual output. The GDP potential is what we think the economy would do at maximum capacity. So at its maximum healthy capacity, what should the economy be doing? When the orange line is below the blue line, we have concerns about recessions, right? We're underperforming what our economy can do. That's usually because of something like a lack of confidence or other drivers of recessions. Obviously, it wasn't necessarily a lack of confidence that all of a sudden inspired COVID, but COVID did scare people and create a lack of confidence, right? And so we see things like this spike right here for COVID. We also see these other periods where it's above the blue line. What those are is inflation concerns, right? These are areas where the economy is essentially going faster than it should. What does that mean to go faster than it should? What it means is that the economy is trying to do more than it has capacity for. So this is when job markets get really, really tight, right? So there's tons of job postings and not enough people to fill them. Well, when that happens, obviously firms are trying to do more than there are people to do the things. And so what ends up happening is that we bid up salaries, people make more money, but then they want to go buy stuff, but then there's not enough stuff being produced because there's not enough workers to make it all. And so what ends up happening is that you get into these inflationary periods. And so what the economy would be doing if it was truly healthy is riding right along this blue line. And so you're going to see these peaks and troughs going around that as the economy tries to target this optimal output. And so over time, things are always adjusting, right? So wages increase, the price of goods increase. That's going to draw back down, the performance of the economy by increasing those prices or the rate at which you have to borrow money. And then that's going to rein in how much companies want to make. On the other hand, if you get into one of these dips, companies are going to say, hey, look, it's really cheap to hire labor right now. I bet we could produce more if we go and hire people. And so then you're going to see these rebounds as people start to be hired back into different companies in order to increase their output. So over time, we see peaks and troughs. And right now, we are in a slightly inflationary period relative to the real GDP potential graph, right? And so that is why we've had higher interest rates in the last few years, trying to basically bring down that attempt to outrun the speed of the economy. So at the national level, we have mixed signals about whether we're going to see a soft landing or a recession. Some things suggest that we're headed right for a soft landing. Some suggest that we're close to a recession. We'll talk about each of those. First up is GDP, right? Suggests a soft landing, and we'll as well as employment and recent inflation data. But we do see things like the labor market cooling off. We see spending on credit and higher interest rates as things that might indicate recessions, although none of them are sure signs. So let's talk about our soft landing signals first. In GDP, one of the things that is quite remarkable is how strong U.S. GDP growth has been over the last few years. And so in particular, we see here that there is GDP growth at an annualized rate of about 2.8% in the third quarter of 2024. And this is driven largely by the high growth rate in personal consumption. Um, so basically, people are consuming like they're pretty confident in the economy. So that's a good thing, right? That means that right now people are buying stuff like they're not afraid that everything's about to fall apart. That tells us that um, that's a sign that the economy is not necessarily headed for a recession. Um, over here on the right-hand side, you can see how much of the economy is driven by these different categories of spending, right? And so the reason that we're going to focus so much on consumption expenditure is that it is a huge chunk of the economy. And so while there's these other numbers down here, they are going to be less. They're going to have a smaller effect on overall GDP growth. In terms of the overall US labor market, um, the overall market is slowing down, but we still definitely have demand in excess of new hires across the country. So historically, you can see over a very long time period here, there were fewer job openings than new hires. That started to shift as we came out of the Great Recession. That was a very uh, long recession. Uh, as we got into the recovery period here during the late 2010s, you see that the job openings start to exceed the number of new hires. So, in other words, there's a tightening labor market. Then you have, look how crazy this spot where COVID is, right? Everything goes crazy for a minute there during lockdowns and COVID. And then as we come back out of that, we see that there is a very tight labor market. There are a lot more jobs than new hires. So in other words, people want to hire more workers than can be hired. And so we see more job openings than we do hires. And that's persisted over time since we emerged from the pandemic. Um, that tells us that we still have healthy demand for labor, right? There are not more layoffs happening. I guess people have not stopped looking for new workers, right? There are still people out there looking for new workers, trying to hire them, and we have not seen those two things flip to the point that there are more workers than jobs available, right? Which then makes it likely that the unemployment rate would increase. On the other side here, we've got let's see, totally forgetting this one. Let's see, month-to-month employment change. Sorry. So we've still got growth in employment over here. So we're not just seeing the new hires over here, we're actually seeing the change in employment. We still see that this graph is overwhelmingly on the positive side. There was like one little blip right here, and that was a while ago now. You can look back and you can see what the Great Recession looked like. And you can see how it was kind of this deep dip right here in terms of how many workers were employed. And then during the pandemic, you can see how sharp this one was. It was totally different than what a normal recession looks like. And so we don't see anything like this yet, right? We don't see anything looking like the Great Recession yet, or like the earlier recessions that were a little bit shallower. And so there's not signs of declines in employment yet. So our unemployment rate is low and staying pretty low. Uh, our interest rate, or inflation rate, sorry, our inflation rate is still a little bit higher than we want, but is fairly steady right now. So we'll talk about this one on the left first. So with the unemployment rate, we saw all the new hires and stuff like that, but what we also want to know is how many people are there who are looking for jobs and haven't been able to find one, right? So an unemployment rate of about 4% is a pretty decent unemployment rate. It's for those who are wondering, it'll never hit zero. That's just because people go in and out of different jobs all the time, and so there's always people turning over. And so we have what we call a natural rate of unemployment, which is when an economy is healthy, there are people unemployed just because people are transitioning between jobs. And you want that because you want people transitioning between jobs because that means they're moving to where they're most effective. What you don't want is long-term unemployment or spikes in the unemployment rate that are not the same as that long run rate of unemployment. And so when we see these kind of flat spots here at like 4%, that's a nice healthy economy with people moving jobs. What you don't want to see is these giant spikes like we saw during COVID or these big peaks during the Great Recession, because that means that there are people who can't find jobs. And it's not just because they're switching jobs, it's because they can't find one. And so we don't really see any signs of that in the unemployment rate right now. It's nice and healthy, right around 4%. And that's overall a good thing. On the inflation side, obviously we don't want this bout of inflation that we had during COVID again, right? So coming out of the recession, we had very high inflation rates, at least for the US, right? On a global scale, this inflation rate is not terrible. It's a big shock when you're used to basically 0% interest rates and very low inflation like the US has been used to for the last decade or two. But it is something that we've been able to manage. You can see that the Federal Reserve Bank has been successful in increasing interest rates in order to bring inflation back down. It's still above this dotted line, which is their target, right? So 2% is their target rate of inflation. They aren't quite there yet, but they're pretty darn close, which means that in terms of what they're aiming for, we don't see signs of a recession yet in unemployment, and we don't see it in GDP growth, but we do see the decline in inflation. That's really good. So we've been able to get much closer to our targeted inflation rate without generating high levels of unemployment or negative GDP growth so far. Now, what might make us think that there are concerns that we might enter a recession in the near future? Because, it's not all sunshine and roses, right? There are some signs that we might be close to a recession. Some of these have to do with debt. First off, if you look at the graph on the left, in terms of employee compensation, we do see growth in compensation, right? So people's wage growth is about 5 to 6%, depending on which month you're looking at. The problem part is not the wage growth. The problem part is that consumer spending is growing faster. So this red set of bars is higher than the blue set of bars. So compensation is blue, spending is red. If your spending is outgrowing your compensation, that's not a great sign. And so this is a problematic sign. It doesn't necessarily point to a looming recession, but it is a concern, right? Obviously, people can't spend more than they make for forever. And so that can definitely be a sign for concern. And we can see that reflected in credit card balances, right? So if we look at this graph on the right, there has been a large growth in average credit card balances since the end of the pandemic, with a strong upward trend. Again, you can't carry stuff over on your credit card forever, right? Eventually, you have to pay off the credit card. So when we look at these measures of household debt, we do see some signs for concern, but they are not surefire things that we are going to enter a recession, right? It might just be that people decide to, start spending in line with their compensation growth, and then we can, we see these things balance out. But it does look like a cause to, something to keep an eye on as we go forward. In terms of the housing market, another signal of recessions, we do see very high fixed rate mortgages, or mortgage rates, I guess I should say, as high as they've been since basically the early 2000s. So we have interest rates that are, in the 6.5%, 7% range, much higher than they were, coming out of the Great Recession, where we had these historically low interest rates for quite a prolonged period. That is not where we're at right now. And so why does that matter? Well, that affects people's confidence in the economy, right? Because if I want to try and buy a new home to start a family, if I want to buy a bigger home, or I want to move, it's going to hurt, right? If I was previously paying a lower mortgage rate or had no mortgage, adding a 7% interest rate to a large purchase is going to be something I'm going to feel, right? And so it's going to make the payment I have to make significantly higher. So when we see those higher interest rates, that's going to affect people's willingness to purchase homes, which is going to affect our confidence in the direction of the economy. And as we know, confidence is a huge driver of whether or not we enter recessions. So definitely something to pay attention to there will be as the Federal Reserve Bank decreases interest rates in order to try and, now that inflation is coming down, we see decreasing interest rates from the Federal Reserve. As we observe that, if we see lowering interest rates on 30-year mortgages, that would be something that will lessen our concern that we might be facing a recession in the near-term future. But for now, this is pointing up, not down. And so one of the other signs that we often see, I'll point out the zero line is right here. So this zero line is where there is no percent change in home prices from month to month, right? So what we're looking at here is home prices and their percentage change from the previous year in any given month. What we're trying to figure out is are home prices rising or falling, because they often fall right before a recession. So you can see these sharp declines, nice red arrows there, showing us that declines in home price growth are going to often indicate recessions. Now, they don't always, right? Here's a nice steep decline that did not directly lead to a recession, but this one did. And then as we get out here towards the Great Recession, we obviously had a huge decline in home prices around the Great Recession. We see some other declines in different spots. They don't always point down to lead to recessions, but we see a really big one that looks a lot more like the Great Recession than it does any of the other downward movements on this graph. And so there is a concern that declining home prices will lead to a recession in the near term. So again, we haven't seen the recession yet, and GDP hasn't pointed us to one yet, but we do see some signals that give us cause for concern about whether or not we might face a recession in the near future. The most reliable indicator of a recession is the yield curve, which is a measure of how interest rates for government debt, right, for federal debt, relate to basically how the interest rates differ over time for federal debt. So you can buy federal debt that is short term, so down to like 3 months. You can buy federal debt up to longer term, like 10-year debt. What we're focused on is, under normal conditions, the interest rate is going to be lower in the short term than it is in the long term, right? Because if I think the economy is healthy, there's not much risk involved in holding federal debt in the short term. But I don't know what's going to happen in the long term, right? Obviously in the long term, pretty much anything can happen, right? We could go to war, we could, have a huge recession, we could, pandemics could happen. But in the short term, I might have more information saying I'm not really worried. So under normal conditions, you'll have a lower interest rate in the short term and a higher interest rate in the long term. As the economy slows down, this yield curve starts to invert. So when you hear people talking about an inverted yield curve, if you ever hear that phrase thrown around, people love saying these things and sounding smart without actually telling you what they mean. But when we see an inverted yield curve, what that means is that the short-term interest rate, you can see it is higher here, and then by the time we get to a recession, the short-term interest rate is going to be higher than the long-term interest rate, right? Because again, what's going to happen? In the short term, I'm nervous, right? I think that, it might be a dangerous thing to hold federal debt. But in the long term, I know that things are going to get sorted out. And so over time, I'm less concerned about the economy, but in the short term, I have concerns. I'm going to expect to be compensated more for holding federal debt in the short term. While it's risky to me, I might get laid off. I might have to use that money to pay my mortgage, right? Instead of investments. And so, in the short term, I'm going to expect more compensation for holding that debt than I am in the long term, where I'm more comfortable that I'll be able to find another job, I'll be able to have other sources of income. And so in a recession, we see an inverted yield curve. And that is one of the best indicators that we have found of predicting recessions. So here's what the yield curve looks like if you just make it a number. When you see a negative number, that means that we have an inverted yield curve, right? So the short-term interest rate is higher than the long-term interest rate. When we see it above zero, that's a good thing. That means the short-term interest rate is lower than the long-term interest rate. And so for most of time, you see these really healthy, normal, positive values all through this graph. And then right before recessions, you see inverted yield curves. And so you see them before many, many recent's a strong word, right? Going back to the 70s, we see an inverted yield curve before every recession to date, up until now. So we also see an inverted yield curve right now. It's been inverted for a while. So far, we haven't experienced a recession. So we're not really sure what to make of that, because normally when we see an inverted yield curve, we do in fact see a recession, almost perfectly. So it's kind of weird right now. We don't really know what to make of the fact that there isn't a recession to go with the inverted yield curve, because that was our best indicator and it's not working. So we don't really know what to say about that as economists. I guess maybe a better macroeconomist would have something better to say than me, but I don't have any good reason to think that the inverted yield curve makes sense right now, based on, yeah, I don't have any good information on that one. So looks like a sign of a recession, but we don't see a recession. So we're very curious about that. But let's zoom in a bit, right? All of that was national data. Let's go ahead and zoom in, talk a little bit more about Omaha and the region, right? Because things are a little bit different in Omaha. I feel like I always hear that whenever I'm talking to people. People are always saying things are different in Omaha, and they're not wrong. When it comes to economic indicators, Omaha works a little bit differently than other places. And in general, that's a pretty good thing. So let's check it out. Since COVID, Omaha has added about 67,000 jobs in net. You can see that, here was our growth trend over time before the pandemic, right? So if I was to draw a trend line, it would go somewhere right along here, right? And it would draw out to like right here if it was going to be like a steady growth rate. We're basically back on that trend line from pre-pandemic levels, right? So we had this huge dip due to the pandemic. Employment expanded rapidly during this period. We've now basically lined back up with where growth patterns were beforehand. So nice, healthy job growth over the last couple of years to get us back on track to pre-pandemic trends. Unemployment in Omaha is historically and currently lower than the national level. This indicates that there is a very tight labor market in Omaha. As a matter of fact, sometimes you will hear people say that perhaps the unemployment rate in Omaha is too low. What that means is that it's very hard to find workers to hire, right? The unemployment rate is so low that it makes it difficult for firms to increase output when they're out doing really good business. And so there's a very low unemployment rate, awesome for workers, a little bit harder when it comes to hiring people, right? There's just not that many unemployed people. And so it's a very tight labor market relative to the national labor market. You can see what that means is that, getting back here closer to the recession, there was a much lower unemployment rate. So as the national level fell, there was less falling to do in Omaha. When we got into the pandemic, our unemployment rate did not spike as high as the rest of the country. It fell quickly, just like the rest of the country, though, and it fell to extremely low unemployment levels for a while here, where it was even below 3%. And so there was an extremely tight labor market for a little while there. We've kind of returned to our long-term trend, though. You can see it's 3% for a very long time here before the pandemic. We're back at a pretty flat little trend there of 3%. So that seems to kind of be the steady state in Omaha. So employment's fairly stable, but job openings are slowing down. So rather than having this huge chunk of job openings like we did post-pandemic, we now see relatively fewer job openings. So about half relative to this peak up here. So peak at about 50,000 job openings. Now we see about 25,000. So we are slowing down in terms of the we're slowing down in terms of the number of jobs that are struggling to fill. On the other graph, right, we can look over here. There are many fewer jobs per unemployed person at this point, right? So there's now about 1.5 jobs for each unemployed person. So I guess for every 2 unemployed people, there's 3 jobs. So that's a lot lower than the almost 5 that we saw at the peak of demand back when unemployment was extremely low. But the job market is cooling off. And like it says on the slide, it looks more like reaching equilibrium than like tanking, right? It's not like just plunging to oblivion. But what is happening is that we seem to have finally managed to get people back into all the positions that we want to hire for. We're slowing back down to kind of more steady state job openings and unemployment levels. If we look at a national level and compare it to Nebraska, Nebraska has one of the lowest job vacancy rates. What that means is that our labor market is not looking for workers quite as aggressively as some of these states over here on the far left-hand side of our graph. We see Nebraska over here. We have one of the lower job vacancy rates. That means that there's not that many jobs just sitting unoccupied, right? Jobs get filled. So again, we're getting to that equilibrium where jobs are mostly filling in. We have some movement between jobs, but we don't have excessive demand for workers like we did during the first years after the pandemic. On this graph, what you're going to see are 2 kind of related things. They don't have to overlap. So I know they overlay nicely on this chart. They are not necessarily going to be tethered together. So we don't have to look quite at like whether the black bars are above or below the red line. But we do want to compare how these 2 things move together. So the black bars are weekly earnings. The red bar is CPI, which is an estimate of how much stuff costs. And so it's the consumer price index, and it just kind of tells us relative to our baseline, what is our index. And so our index started right around here in 2019. So relative to 2019, obviously things cost less before 2019, and things cost more afterwards because we've had, there's always some inflation. But what we also see are that weekly earnings have been growing at a healthy rate, right? So over this time period, basically, we've seen wages increase at about the same rate as CPI has increased on this graph. Now, the question then becomes, what about most recently? Well, we actually see these black bars have flattened out. And so our weekly earnings are flattening out while inflation is still a thing, right? So we still have inflation. It hasn't gone to zero, but our wage growth has kind of flattened out. And so that could be problematic going forward. But it's not an immediate cause for concern. It's just to note that prices continue to rise, but wages have taken a break from rising temporarily. You can see some of that, happening in other periods in here as well. It's not a permanent fixture. It's just a thing that's happening right now. So wages are not rising exactly in line with CPI at the moment. Our taxable sales have been doing good. We've had a nice, healthy 31% growth in taxable sales in Omaha since June 2020. So real healthy growth here. You can see we did have some drops in sales during the pandemic, but you also see that we quickly recovered, and we've had nice sales growth over time since then. But up here where where we get into the most recent months, we do kind of see this stabilization and flattening out of taxable sales. So not a strong growth there. Obviously, it's kind of jumping around based on the month, but our smoothed out trend line, which is the orange line here, pretty flat. So if we smooth out all the bumps, it looks like there's steady but not increasing taxable sales in the last year or so. On the inflation level, Omaha tends to experience a little bit less inflation than the US as a whole. But it also kind of experiences it at different points. So if we look back to the start of the pandemic, inflation rates hit Omaha early. Um, you might think, honestly, that you could probably explain that by supply chain issues, right? We're in the middle of the country, so when goods are being brought to the US, we're in the middle of the country, right? It takes more effort to get it here. And so there might have been higher inflation as we had to compensate more to make sure that things moved during the pandemic. On the other hand, as inflation peaked in the US, it actually dropped off in Omaha pretty significantly. And so we can see in the most recent months, inflation nationally has been significantly higher than the inflation rate in Omaha, which is well below that Federal Reserve target of 2%. We're actually closer to 1% at the moment. So inflation in Omaha has declined significantly since the peak of the pandemic, and we now see quite low inflation rates here in Omaha, which is a good thing, right? It means that our costs are not rising too quickly. Um, let's talk a little bit more about costs, though. The cost of living in Omaha still doing pretty great relative to the U.S. as a whole, as well as to other cities around the Midwest and Great Plains. So if we look at all the other comparable cities, I guess that we've got listed out here, um, Omaha is doing pretty well. So overall, it is the second least expensive city on this list, aside from Oklahoma City. So what are the prime drivers here? One of the big ones is housing is particularly inexpensive in Omaha. Um, Everything else seems to be pretty close in line. So our groceries are slightly higher than a couple of these, or than Des Moines, right? But uh, Des Moines and Oklahoma City have slightly lower grocery rates, but everybody else has higher priced groceries. If we look at our housing again, yeah, Omaha is a nice low housing cost. Um, so that gives us a good cost of living advantage. In terms of utilities, we're about in the middle of the group. Uh, Same for transportation and for healthcare. So pretty much on par everywhere else. The real difference here is that we have particularly low housing costs, except for Oklahoma City. And so, in fact, the housing costs in Omaha are about 17 or 18% lower than across the US as a whole. So that leads to lower cost of living because that's definitely one of the biggest costs, and as people are, budgeting. House prices in Omaha tend to be more stable than those across the U.S. But we tend to have a very active market. So houses are not on the market for long, and I think that honestly, that active market that is, has quick turnover is what is leading to more stable house prices, right? Because it's well known what houses should be selling for because houses are selling continuously. That allows us to have better information, not exaggerate gains when we go to these big peaks that we see nationally, but also not to see the big dips because we have a steady active market. And so we don't see these places where sales drop off and prices have to decline in order to keep sales high. So when we see the number of days on the market, you can see how that kind of is an inverted version of this graph, right? So low days on market, high prices, high days on market, low prices. In Omaha, that's much more stable, and so are the house prices. So we have a nice predictable housing market. Makes it a lot easier for us to, maintain stable, steady economy. And so, this is something saying that, all else equal, Omaha is probably less likely to get into a recession than the rest of the country is. When we look at residential and non-residential building permits, we see that they are pretty stable, although more volatile in the residential side than it is on the non-residential side. They are both fairly stable. So All good things there, with a slight uptick in activity for building in the last little bit this year. So, what this tells us overall and brings us to a really interesting point is that Omaha's overall economy tends to be less volatile than the overall US. Recessions tend to be milder, but expansionary periods also tend to be milder. So we don't grow as quickly during peak growth periods in the US, but we don't enter into as severe of recessions as the overall US. So much more stable economy than we observe nationwide. And so you can see that here. The red graph is the US as a whole. You can see it goes higher on the upside, but it also goes lower on the downside. Omaha, on the other hand, is much closer to this stable 0 point here on both sides, right? Our recessions tend to be milder. Our growth periods tend to also be milder. So as we look at Omaha, we want to kind of understand, why is it that it's more stable? Why is it less volatile than the overall US economy? So what we're actually going to look at here is a comparison of Omaha and Baton Rouge. Baton Rouge is about the same size as Omaha. And one of the key differences between the two cities, though, is which industries or which sectors are the prime business sectors in each city. You can see that Baton Rouge has a much larger proportion of its economy tied to manufacturing. That is the largest sector of their economy. On the other hand, finance, insurance, real estate, rental, and leasing is the biggest sector in the Omaha economy, right? Followed up by professional and business services, right? So when we look at the economy of Omaha, if you skip down to the bottom yellow line, you'll see the really important part. The businesses that dominate in Omaha are less sensitive to business cycles than the businesses that are big in other places. So Omaha is successfully diversified in a way that makes it less sensitive to a business cycle, right? It's not that there is no manufacturing. It's not that there is no part of our economy that is susceptible to business cycles. But what we see is that Omaha's economy is not solely built around those types of business or industry. And so what that means is that we don't tend to fluctuate in the same way as the rest of the country during upticks and downticks in the business cycle. So if we look at this graph here on the bottom left, when a recession strikes, this number here is the difference between employment at the peak of the expansionary period to the bottom of the recession. And when we look at these in Omaha, these values tend to be smaller than they are in Baton Rouge. So during the 2001 recession, Omaha experienced a 2% dip from its peak employment level, Baton Rouge 2.5%. In the Great Recession, 3.5% in Omaha, it was over 4% in Baton Rouge. In 2020, during the pandemic, it was a 10% decline in employment in Omaha and 15% in Baton Rouge. And so overall, we're going to see less dramatic swings in the employment levels, in the growth rate of the city itself here in Omaha when compared to many other cities. Some cities are going to also be built like Omaha, where they're less susceptible to business cycles. But overall, Omaha is less sensitive to business cycles than the US as a whole, which means that most cities are going to be more sensitive to business cycles than Omaha is. So now that we've talked about where we're at and what we see right now, what do we see going forward? So for both the US and Omaha, we actually honestly are expecting a soft landing. Current opinion is that the Federal Reserve Bank has successfully managed interest rates in a way that's going to prevent us from entering an outright recession, which is great news. It does mean that we expect the economy to slow down. It does not mean that we expect it to contract. So, what do we see over time? Over time, Omaha is the blue line, right? And the US economy is the orange line. So obviously, Omaha is not going to swing as wildly as the overall US trend. But we do expect to see a slowdown as we go into 2025, both in the US and in Omaha. But we expect to see it stabilize and smooth out. So our current predictions are that there is going to be uh, a a convergence toward the long-term steady state GDP growth and interest rates that the Federal Reserve Bank has been targeting. Um, it's great news. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it seems to be the most likely thing right now. Um, again,
Dusty, sorry to
yeah.
interrupt. Just to know, we have about 5 minutes left. We have a couple questions in the Q&A.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
No, you're good.
Okay. I'll hurry through this part then. Make sure I don't miss anything though. So we do see we expect to see slow and steady growth in employment as well as in income per capita. So overall, just a slow and steady growth is kind of what we expect for Omaha. Um, if we see a hard landing, so if we do see a recession, we expect that it will actually be fairly mild. So right now, the U.S. is in pretty good shape overall. We saw that GDP growth is still good. We see that Omaha is less likely to enter recessions than the country as a whole. And so when we expect there to be a small recession in the US, we might even not see a recession in Omaha at all. So here's for the overall US, right? The baseline prediction from the last slide is this blue line right here. If we see a recession, it will dip down, right? But it's not going to be a huge dramatic recession. It'll be a short-term recession with, a small contraction. On the other hand, if we see that recession at the US level, what we expect to see in Omaha is a slowdown, but not actually a recession. And so overall, Omaha is looking in pretty good shape. The economy is diverse. We expect that to insulate us from the worst effects of any slowdowns, and overall to hopefully see some continued healthy growth in the Omaha economy.
Thanks so much, Dusty. We appreciate your informative presentation. We had a couple questions that came up in the chat. So one was, which sector would include the medical professions? Would that be professional and business services? It seems like Omaha has a large share of jobs in medical professions.
Yes, let me take a look at that. Nope. Healthcare is, sorry, let me share my screen again so you can see it.
Yeah.
Oh no. Okay, lost my controls while I was looking at this slide. There it is. Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. You're good.
Get this back up. Okay, so healthcare is right here in this educational services, healthcare, and social assistance, and it is a large chunk, right? This is 8.7% of the Omaha economy. That's almost 10%, right? So that's a pretty big chunk of the economy. So yes, we do see it right there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then we had another question. With the upcoming presidency planning to implement tariffs that could cause product inflation, how would the Federal Reserve handle such a policy? Could this inflate the possibility for a recession?
Yeah, that would be one of the prime concerns for a recession in the near future would be tariffs. Tariffs are going to create inflationary pressure. If the best way to get rid of inflationary pressure is to increase interest rates, and what that would do is drive people's confidence in their ability to purchase things down, right? It would reduce consumer spending power because it would inflate away gains in wages and other benefits that we've seen from wage growth. So yeah, that would be the primary concern in terms of what could spark recession in the near term. It doesn't mean it's the only thing, but it's probably the prime concern at this point.
Okay, and one more technical. This
See if I
is
can
from
answer
one
that
of
one.
our graduate research assistants, so it's good to know that they're paying attention. I would like to know if you can elaborate more on how you can estimate the GDP potential. Do you use the Hodrick-Prescott filter or something more sophisticated? What instrument would you recommend for calculating it?
That's a great question. as not a macroeconomist, I'm not great at that part. So, my suggestion would be to use what the federal government puts out. I really have no good answer to that. I don't know enough about estimating what the full potential GDP is. So that is just me using publicly available data, not not calculating it myself.
No. Good advice to always look at what resources are available first.
Dusty, can I ask a couple quick questions?
Cams.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get everybody off on time, but we have an amazing resource in front of us, and I just want to check a couple things, and we can try to answer them pretty quick. The wage growth versus inflation slide. I just had a really long conversation with a business owner in this community, and if wage growth is tracking so close to inflation, does that mean that I don't really feel more money in my pocket?
Yeah.
My wages have gone up, but inflation has gone up very closely. Is
Yeah.
that kind of what that's saying?
Yes, and I think the thing to keep in mind, as someone who has not switched jobs in the last 8 years,
And we definitely don't get paid more here.
people who are switching jobs are the ones who are the primary beneficiaries of these wage increases, right? So
It's not totally artificial, right? There's some people that would argue if it's tracking so close to that, then it doesn't matter. Wage growth isn't actually driving our economy in a good direction. It's the same. But you're saying because of some job switching, it's not totally that way.
it's kind of lumpy, right? I mean, these are averages. So some people are going to be experiencing very nice wage growth. Some people are going to be experiencing less nice wage growth, and it's going to vary from household to household.
Well, and isn't that a great statistics point in general? I also just wanted to mention something. You talked a lot about housing. I talked a little bit about housing. When we are talking about metros, this is a very general question. When we're talking about metros versus state economies, they tend to be pretty different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just really wanted to point that out. Those occupation mix, that, those diversity of industries that you were talking about, that really helps Omaha is not consistent statewide and makes metros really should be compared to metros, but a lot of times we like to think of our one Nebraska, so it can, those state numbers obscure some really interesting differences that are going on in our metros. So I'm so glad you brought those out, but I just wanted to say that to everyone who listened to the presentation.
Yeah, and as an illustration of that, I grew up in the Seattle area, and Seattle is a tech and high-tech manufacturing area, right? You've got Boeing and these other, aerospace manufacturing stuff. You've got Microsoft. The other big city in Washington is Spokane, which is radically different from Seattle, and it is not a high-tech industry, right? I mean, the industry there is not based on high-tech stuff. It's based on mining and forestry and other, really important industries, but they're totally different. And so when you look at the state patterns, they're not going to resemble either one, right? Because they're going to be a mix of these two totally different types of industry mixes. And when you look at Nebraska, it's going to be the same, right? We tend to think more of like urban versus rural in Nebraska. And so you're going to see a very different mix of industries when you're looking at the rural areas in Nebraska versus Omaha. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right that it's important to think about them as separate entities, right? Different cities have very different mixes of industry, and that makes them more and less susceptible to different kinds of events.
Thank you so much. Dusty came in for us last minute, and as you all just saw, he's an amazing resource here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and I thank him.
Thanks for letting me
Thank you, Dusty. We appreciate it. So that brings us to the end of our data series for today. A couple quick reminders before you leave. Someone is going to throw up on the screen the QR code that you can scan, and there's links in the chat that Tara has already put in there. So please, that will take you to the webpage where you can find the presentation materials and the evaluation for today. Please complete that evaluation and share your feedback with us. We really do appreciate that. It was in the evaluation last time that you all recommended presentations on economic resources from the Census Bureau and kind of an overview of the national and metropolitan economy. So that is why we brought you those great presentations today. So we appreciate your feedback, and it really does inform our presentations for next year. You will also receive a link or an email to the recording when it's available. It will be on that same webpage where all the presentation slides are. I want to give a shout out to our Tara Grell and Dina Lund, who are behind the scenes here. Dina is our community service specialist, and Tara, our public communications and creative coordinator, who have coordinated all of this today. So we appreciate them and all the work they do for us. On behalf of the CPAR team, I just want to wish everybody a very happy holiday season. We look forward to working with you in the new year, so please reach out for all of your data needs. And thank you all for attending today. We hope you have a great holiday season. Thank you.